I'm a painter. I'm an associate professor of painting at the Michaelis School of Fine Art, and my own practice is a multiple practice in the sense that I'm essentially a painter. And the image that begins this talk is a fairly recent painting from last year with a slightly awkward title of Holes and Things, and Absences and Presence. But in this talk, I'd actually like to follow a certain trajectory of South African art activists, environmental activists, because there's a very particular bias in South Africa in relation to climate change activists and artists. It's slightly different, I think, certainly it's very different from what's happening in Europe and in many of the American circumstances. And whilst we have people like Gideon Mendel, who is probably one of the more internationally known artists, who has been doing a whole fascinating series on floods, where he photographs people in countries where there have been floods, towns where there have been floods, and he photographs people in their own homes, literally sometimes up to their necks in water. He is, in a sense, documenting the disaster that's happened. To understand what a lot of South African artists are doing, they are documenting in another kind of a way the travails and difficulties of being connected to a land from which they have been largely disconnected through apartheid, through colonial settlement, and from various places where there is a dispossession of land. So since the 1913, 1917 Native Land Act, when people were reduced to minuscule areas of land, indigenous people lost their lands. So one of the things that I'd like to follow, I mean, given that there are a lot of artists working with environmental issues in South Africa, but I want to pick up on one small thread, and it's a key thread, it's a kind of spine to what most environmental activism is engaged with in this country, and that is the issue of land. So if we're still looking at the artists who work photographically, Santu Mofokeng, someone who picked up on a number of the places where land was being damaged, and as a consequence, people were being damaged. So he made a series of photographs of the Klip River near Soweto. And in those photographs, they're called radiant landscapes, and they are very orange images. They're images directly into the water, and they kind of glow. But the radiance in them is more to do with radioactivity rather than a kind of spiritual radiance. Whilst they're used for baptisms and purification, these rivers are more damaging than purifying. They are full of toxicity, they're polluted, and the body that returns to it to be purified is in fact damaging itself and in danger. And Mofokeng, in about 2011, he made an observation that seems to be absolutely critical for the way many artists approach their work in this country. He said, democratic South Africa, that is yet to take psychic ownership of the land it has inherited from the apartheid ancestors. And it's partly to do with the political and socio-political and historical battles that continue in South Africa. And therefore, the key issue there is land. There was an exhibition on land in the National Gallery in Cape Town, and there were fewer images of land and more images of people. We're talking about an intersectional relationship here between politics, the social world, the economic world, and the human being in that struggle. So what you find is that there are artists who focus almost exclusively on soil as their main medium. And in this regard, there's a particular video that is, I think, very succinct in its engagement with the difficulties of that land discussion. Lorato Shadi made this 7-minute video. It's a very simple video. It focuses on the lower half of a young woman's face. We see her mouth and her shoulders. Her eyes remain invisible to us. The gesture is simple. She puts something in her mouth. At first, it's unclear what it is. A red, brown, crumbly substance, not unlike a chocolate brownie, except that it isn't. It's a clump of earth. She starts to chew. It's difficult. Her mouth battles to find the saliva to lubricate this unlikely food. She puts in more soil before being able to swallow the first mouthful. The body resists, she puts in more. She continues to chew. She tries again to swallow. She eats with her mouth firmly closed, only opening it to pack in more. She starts to gag. She continues to chew. Viewers watching flinch as they empathize with the body's rejection of this unpalatable substance. As the video continues, her nose begins to run, her eyes to stream. Still she attempts to chew. Her fingers push in more. Her mouth can no longer close. A clod of earth has rootlets sticking out of it. She forces it in. She coughs. She's having difficulty breathing. Earth falls from her mouth. Her snot runs down her upper lip into it. She uses one hand, then two, to force the earth in, to keep it there. Her body judders with the effort, and the screen blackens. What Lorato is engaged with is a practice called geophagia. Geophagia is the eating of earth. It's a global phenomenon, and it's presumed that it might be because the body needs minerals and people are drawn to earth for those minerals. It's also seen perhaps as a sign of mental derangement. But Shardy's particularly referencing it because it's also an action of resistance. It was something that was used by slaves in retaliation or resistance to their slave masters. They used to eat earth until their bellies were full, and then they would die of starvation, thereby depriving the owner of their workforce. When it was discovered that this was their action, the response from the slave owners was to make masks, which they forced onto people's heads so they could not eat unsupervised. I think this video indicates the brutality of the history of colonial countries, power over others. And it's not surprising that the play of earth, or the meaning, the symbolic meaning of earth, in many contemporary artists in South Africa is a conflicted one and a difficult one. There are a number of different performative acts, though, and artists' performance is very, very large in the realm of these engagements with history and the sociopolitics of South Africa. Setembile Msanzi has done a work where it was in the National Gallery, and it's called The Excerpts from the Past. It's an amalgam of historical images. She herself is dressed in a hybrid costume that is both Victorian and indigenous, and she's sitting on a surface, a circle of red soil. In front of her are porcelain cups, and she fills these with earth and attempts to drink from them. But of course, again, it's an unpalatable subject, and she breaks the porcelain cup. Breaking the cup is breaking what is offered to her in the place of her own land. She rejects it. And in this instance, soil is dirt. It is unwanted. This particular piece came out of a period of fees must fall, roads must fall, when there was a very large public resistance in the various educational institutions towards the history of colonial ownership. And at the University of Cape Town, it was a very hard and long tussle around the sculpture and the statue of Rose that used to sit on the steps of the university. And whilst that was being removed, Setembile did a performance where she stood with her arms outstretched, as though reclaiming that space, as though reclaiming the place of dispossession. A lot of the artists who are working with soil present it as it is in the gallery space. Dineo Bapape has been in many international biennials, and often what she does is she stacks soil in great big stratas of form, and then she punctuates that soil strata with shells and herbs and various healing plants and stones, and it becomes a place which is both full of the possibility of healing and recuperation, but is also essentially displaced from its own locale. So that displacement speaks to the dispossession and the need to recuperate that. So soil is a place of origins, it's a place of home. Many of the original creation myths situate the human form in soil. If we go to the Christian Bible, we know that God created Eve out of clay. And so Belinda Blicknow's work finds her working with clay, often in making vessels, which are in the form of the female figure, and the vessel is often seen as the equivalent of a female form, as a container. But she also creates containers in which she herself, she in a sense, builds it around herself. So she becomes inside the container as well as the container. And if you think about that myth of Eve being created out of clay, it's not so much a myth, but a direct literal statement. If you pause to think about it, we are the earth walking. We're so used in the West to seeing ourselves as separate from, not the same as, divided by. But everything we eat, whether you're a vegetarian or a meat eater, comes from the soil. Say the world is made of rock, it then breaks down into soil, and from that everything grows, and then we ingest that. We are essentially the earth walking. And it is that sense of connection that artists are trying to also regain. It's not just a question of political power, it's a question of being in contact with that resonance of the earth in a manner which we can then perhaps tap into, and which can perhaps shift some of the dialogues of the contemporary neoliberal global capitalism that is just eating the world alive, where resources are just being devoured at the rate of such a speed that we simply can't sustain it. Thokoza Zulu made a very interesting and, again, very succinct piece. He made a shovel head out of clay. And that shovel head, if you look at it a second time around, you realize is the neck and top part of a young man's body. It is also, if you look at it closely on the lower right-hand side, it has leaves. It is pages from a book. And what he's managed to do in this incredibly simple form is combine the human form, the tool, the implement by which we dig and grow our plants, and an idea of a book. And there's a conversation about knowledge in the earth, between us and the earth. It is this seeking of how to hear the earth, how to understand what we might need to know from it, what we might have forgotten. So there are artists like Haneen Conradi, who had a grandmother who had a farm with a little river that ran through it that nowadays is barely running, is polluted. The farms above it have taken much of its water resources. So what she did was she visited that farm, collected some of the soil from the riverbed, and took it back to her studio and placed it, rubbed it into a canvas surface, and then ran water along the top of the canvas, letting it trickle down into the soil on the canvas surface. When she stood back, she saw what she calls a sonic landscape. It was almost as though the water in the soil had made its own call again that might be read in a different way. Jenna Birchall made a piece called Songsmith, where she took rocks from the cradle of humankind, and she inserted into those a motion-sensitive element, so that when you bring your hands close to the rock sounds. It sets off a reverberation, resonance. And again, people have to incline their heads to listen to this sound. These are slow pieces that encourage us to look and listen and pay attention, something that perhaps we've forgotten to do in our speeded up world. On this year's Venice Biennial, Cape Town artist Ikshan Adams has made an enormous tapestry. And that tapestry is made up of many, many things. It's not a conventional tapestry. It's made of wire and rope and beads and shells. And it has hanging in front of it a wire construction that looks like a kind of cloud. And it's meant to evoke a cloud. It's meant to invoke the cloud of dust that is kicked up by real dancers when they dance their dance of courtship. The real dance engages the courtship's actions of animals. And one of the things that it also does is it speaks to the dancer's capacity to be present in the world. They stamp their feet hard on the ground, and from that stamping, a cloud of dust arises. You're meant to think about that dust. You're meant to think about the way that we are in contact with the earth. And again, those phrases, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, is something that begins to rise in one's mind. It's a conversation across forms. It opens up boundaries. It makes the skin of our beings less contained and more porous. And the details in that, if you get close to the surface of that tapestry, you will find, as I said, many things, shells and details and precious sparkly bits that make you see the surface differently. The whole image is a very large X, and in fact is taken from a drone image of what are called desire lines in Epping, where people cross a broad tract of land and leave a trail behind them. These desire lines indicate where people would like to go, wish to go, rather than being told where they have to go. And desire lines themselves seem to be a language that we need to perhaps pay more attention to. Francis Knutzer, in his Cape Mongo, collects the detritus of our consumer world. He makes a number of costumes that he wears. And in doing those costumes, he works with plastic, metal, paper, glass, the kinds of things that we put into recycling. But he's interested in a different kind of recycling, a kind of recuperation of these things that we abandon. And in the doing of that, his creatures wander around the city looking for home. They're looking to find their way back to home. His paper beast, for instance, which is made of cardboard, wanders around the city past various shopping malls and tries to find its way back. Eventually it does, to a forest, and dissolves into a tree. The glass figure that he's working with does the same, wanders from the vineyards in the Western Cape, and Knutzer always makes these videos that go with these performative works, and they're always a collision of all sorts of different elements. So you're looking not only at wine as the pleasure of the rich, you're looking at wine as the labor of the worker, of the dispossessed, of those who had their land before this. And the glass is merely an emblem. It's the carrier of wine, but it too has come out of the earth. And it eventually, his glass beast creature ends up back at the seaside, at the beach, and moves back into the sand from which it is made. The finding of one's way home, that's a critical element of so many of these artists' practice. Knutzer's work is often quite aggressively engaged with the city and its consumerized society and its devouring again of the world's resources. But in some more recent work, he's working with the more natural world. Princess Flay outside Cape Town. He's done some work there and is working on a project called A Plant Cyborg. And there you see the creature of or maybe the princess of Princess Flay coming out of the reeds. It's an attempt to once again find a way to speak to the landscape and understand it. And this last weekend, I was lucky enough to go to an artist residency where the artists were working with the idea of recuperation and landscape. And Rio Ngametu was doing a performance work. She herself sees herself primarily as an artist, but was trained as a sangoma. And she set up this range of theatrical performative moments where she both told stories, she worked with wit and humor and parody, she reached back into a kind of distant past where she invoked the ancestors. And in doing so, there was an echo, a reminder that certainly in the West, we tend not to do that. We tend to see ourselves as independent and individuated and can probably only think back as far as our grandmothers and grandfathers. And the idea that the calling on the ancestors is only an African thing and we don't really have to worry about it, that's speaking as somebody from a Caucasian background, is something that perhaps we're beginning to have to recalculate. Because again, if we are the earth walking, we are our ancestors walking too. Every element of their DNA is in our body. It has been passed back down to us. And so calling on our ancestors, recognizing our connections back to our origins, connects us back to our earth. It's a task we have to do. And in this particular performance that she was doing, she went and spoke to everybody. It was a very mixed audience. She spoke to everybody in the audience. And she moved between a kind of play act on one level, but also an intuitive response to the situation. And it was a very embodied engagement and theatrical performance. It wasn't in the end just an act. It was a way of telling a story and drawing us all in. It was set in the Milkwoods near Gansbaai, and therefore it had the reality of the earth as part of its grounding. And earth is not merely a grounding metaphor here. It is a substance we have to wrestle with. She dug a hole and she put her head next to that hole and said, "Can I hear the earth?" And she asked someone else to go and put their head near the hole too. And they said no, they couldn't hear anything. And after that, there was a ceremony, and after that, there was a calling, and after that, there seemed to be something that arose in the group. I mention these things because they're not just isolated artistic practices or activities that few see. They are things that we need to remember, and they're finding their way into a larger conversation in our battle for environmental understandings, freedoms, and liberations. It's interesting to note the Shell seismic blasting that was going along the Wild Coast was contested by 2 court cases. And those court cases were won on the fact that Shell did not consider asking about the cultural heritage of the area. They were dealing with this on purely economic and political lines. And they were thrown out of court, and their actual seismic blasting was stopped because they had not asked the questions. And watching the court case was really interesting because you could go online and watch it. The lawyer was nonplussed. They had never thought about asking those questions about culture and heritage of the communities living along the coastlines. It was not part of their vocabulary, and their case fell on that. And so it's exactly that is being brought to the fore in such instances. The painting that I showed at the beginning became part of a cultural commissions from COP26 in Glasgow. COP is the Conference of the Parties. It's the large global environmental conference that's held every year. And I was asked to participate in a Living Languages Land project. And I approached Sylvia Vollenhoven, First Peoples poet and playwright, to work with me. She saw some of the work that I was doing, and we put together a small video. The idea was to choose a word from an endangered or extinct language. And she chose the word "cow," which is Bushman, preferred term, is an arrow of intention, which once released takes us down many unexpected paths filled with potency and unexpected connection. And if we are to engage our world now, we need to be alive to it. We need to be aware and to hear what we haven't heard before, to notice what we haven't seen. So how? A magical journey, if you apply it to our current environmental crisis and our moment in time, is where the arrow of intention, once released, takes one down many unexpected paths, filled with potency and unexpected connection. And that's what we're seeking. We need to be alive to our world, to listen to it, to see it anew, to understand that we are part of it. So I'm going to give the last word to Sylvia Vollenhoven, who says, we need to find the Gao of now to restore our relationship with the land and the divine within.